Hey guys, what's happening? I'm Nidhi, host of Model Minority, Uniquely American, as I'm sure you guys know, and I'd like to share a very special message with you about the 2020 census. The census is our way of counting everyone living in the United States to determine how resources are allocated and how important decisions are being made. Decisions like funding for schools, roads, public services, and healthcare. Businesses also use this data to decide whether to open up new stores in our neighborhoods. This week, along with other fellow Asian organizations across the country, member shows of the Asian podcast network like Model Minority, Uniquely American, are proud to participate in the 2020 Census Asian Week of Action. Now, if you haven't, take a moment to go to 2020census.gov to fill out your census for your household. This is our last chance for the next 10 years, as you'll see coming up in this episode, and the deadline is fast approaching. It just takes a few minutes, and it can make a decade of impact. We also encourage you to check in with your family and your friends and make sure that they do the same. Let's make sure that the voices of our amazing community are heard loud and clear. Let's get counted and shape our future, here and now. Let's participate in the 2020 census. Thanks a bunch, guys.
And that's what it is when you think we have a one-way highway right into Mexico and these other places. They take our jobs, they take our money, they take our cash.
Get out and vote. We're going to win it so big. This will be Brexit times 10.
What do you think of when you think of immigration? Do you think of chain migration, immigration reform, terrorism scares? All of these things are rhetoric from this past and present election that has fueled anti-immigration policy and sentiment across the United States. All immigrants face a number of issues when they come here. Things such as being far from your family, imposter syndrome in the American workforce, culture shock, language barriers, racism, and more affected the model minority community deeply, and yet the resources provided to them are at staggering lows. I wanted to find out how and why it is that model minorities, and more specifically Asian minorities, gained the name the Invisibles. As it turns out, the model minority myth has a lot to do with our erasure as a group, but it certainly isn't the only issue at hand. I'm Nidhi Shastri, and this is Model Minority, Uniquely American. Hey guys, what's happening? I set out for this episode to first figure out how the model minority myth erases us as minorities. So, within the model minority myth, there's this downplaying of Asian, African, and Middle Eastern struggles. We can't possibly have any issues in America when we're all rich and successful, right? Well, this ideology is in stark contrast to many situations in model minority countries. The view is that we have escaped a polluted nightmare, or, pardon my French, a shithole country to find the American dream. Places that are war-torn, poverty-ridden, and illiterate should have nothing to do with America, a safe haven for those who commit to living better and more civilized. Well, what many Americans already know is that the U.S. actually does have some of these problems. Poverty problems, issues with illiteracy and voter suppression, and even cases of preventable pestilence and disease right here at home. For example, a 2017 article published by NPR discussed hookworm, a nasty parasite that is found in regions in developing countries, more specifically South Asia, Southeast Asia, and African countries. It's found in areas that have high poverty, warm climates, and poor sewage and septic systems. It typically enters a person's bloodstream through their feet when they walk barefoot. Now, of course, nothing like this could possibly be a threat to Americans, right? Wrong. What shocked the reporters at NPR working on this piece was that the same type of worm was affecting people right here at home in Alabama, contaminating their homes and existing communities. It existed in one of the lowest income and fully African American communities in the United States. And you may have already guessed it, but neither the state nor the national government was providing any funds to help. Examples like this one are often used to victim blame in a way. Your country is like this because of XYZ reason, because the people are barbaric, because it's overpopulated. If I had a dime for every time I heard somebody say it's because of overpopulation. Well, if that were truly the case, how do we explain this happening in America? What happened in Alabama is a classic case of systematic oppression of Black Americans, both regarding the lack of aid as well as the lack of a proper septic system in the first place. Likewise, many of these issues in developing countries also stemmed from larger historical problems. All of South Asia was entirely ravaged by colonialization. Many Southeast Asian and African countries met with a similar fate. So, what I'm getting at is, what this assumption largely ignores is how Western nations, including but not limited to North America, have had a large role in why our home countries are so quote-unquote behind. Things like colonialization, slavery, and trade monopolies played a huge role. So what happens when we do finally come to the States from these places, whether that's looking for a better life or a particular reason, such as our family or marriage? Understandably, sometimes people don't quite make it. Now, not everyone here is rich, successful, and perfect, despite what this myth tells us. And the effect, to put it starkly, is that our stories get left out, under-discussed, and overwritten. So let's start with the nuts and bolts of how this myth affects us as invisible minorities, and then we can get into where these stats come from. The U.S. Census. There are tons of examples of issues that affect model minority immigrants. Before we had things like FaceTime and modern technology, it was even harder for immigrants from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East to stay connected to their homes. And I know this sounds like a back in my day type of situation, but I certainly remember the days when my mom would buy calling cards and phone her family in India at 3 a.m. in the morning due to the time difference. Now, in America, luckily our technology has advanced quickly, but in places in India, Pakistan, or rural China, or South Africa, you'll see that they don't have the same technologies as we do here. Stuff like internet is not as easily accessible, which creates a divide for immigrants from their home countries even today. And for those who work in lower income jobs, mustering up enough money for you and your family to travel to Bangladesh or Thailand or Nigeria, especially if you're in the Midwest, costs a pretty penny. Also, the people who come here aren't by random chance either. Many work to reach the very top academically and financially before they can get either a visa lottery ticket or go through the years-long process that it takes for a visa to have a chance to come to America. Hence, the saying that we're just letting anybody in is actually quite wrong. In fact, it's truly the opposite.
Well, first of all, thank you for doing this with me. I think it will allow me to actually express my views of something I haven't thought about, but maybe I've experienced it. So thank you for that.
Of course.
So my name is Maimouna Barrow. I am Associate Director for the Center for African Studies. And I actually got my graduate degrees from this institution. I got my MA in African Studies and PhD in Education. And I've been here in this position as Associate Director since 2005. So I've actually published a few articles and worked on my dissertation, which became a book in 2009. So I try to keep up with my research whenever there is the possibility to do so.
I sat down with Dr. Barrow, Associate Director of African Studies at the University of Illinois, to discuss the model minority myth.
A good thing is called the myth because I think it's a myth. When one gets out of the home country to go study anywhere, because the whole purpose of you going out, getting out of your country and leaving everything you know behind, just to go get an education, you're going to have to focus on that education, right? And if you happen to have children while you are still doing what you need to do here away from home, you're going to make sure that they also put a lot of attention on their education, right? But it's a myth because I think that although people who come here through scholarship, usually they're selected, they may be among the best, but because when they come here, they have to deal with a new educational system. Whatever you succeed in, you have to work hard to get it. It's not like we can generalize about these people who make it. We can say that they're given something that others are not given. We all start from zero and then we happen to make it or don't make it. But it's a miss because not everybody makes it actually. There are some people who come here, their primary goal is to get an education, but they can't actually pay for their studies, you know. They may come with a master's degree in a field, but because of the whole problem of equivalence or because of price, the cost of getting an education, they can't actually even set foot in a university. So we can't really generalize about people who are coming, whether from Africa or Asia, that they come, they make it. Well, how about the people who can't even make it? Do we pay attention to those? But those who happen to make it, they're here solely because they want to better their lives. They're here for an opportunity. Do we also realize the fact that these are people who go through a lot of issues? They may make it, but they deal with everything that other groups have to deal with. They have to make sure that they're in the field they want to be in. First of all, it's very competitive. You have to apply, get into the right department, and also make sure that after that you have a job, you know. Some decide to change somehow mid-career just because they couldn't make it. Some, as I said earlier, they don't even set foot in an institution of higher education.
Going off of this, a hallmark, as we all know from the last episode, of the model minority myth is the implications that we are all economically and educationally well off. Because of this, resources such as job hunting aid, visa and immigration aid, and even government assistance programs and university scholarships are scarce. Studying here is like a race to the top, except no one wins. While stats point to Asians earning the most compared to other racial groups, those stats are independent of other factors, such as family size, number of dependents, and number of working household members.
Exactly. When people succeed, you know, you can't just succeed in all aspects of your life. You're gonna probably have to give up something. Like, for instance, a mother who is raising a family and at the same time is working on getting tenure, you know. Yeah, you can maybe work hard and do what you have to do on both sides, but you're gonna have to sacrifice a lot. And maybe you're gonna say, okay, I'm gonna take my time here, 10 years, I can work on it. Instead of doing it in 10 years, maybe it's gonna take me 15 years to get to full professorship. And then you have to make the choice. If you're gonna put things on hold, take care of a small family, if that's what you have to do, that's what you're gonna have to do. But either way you look at it, people make sacrifices. And I mean, it doesn't matter where they are from, really. You can be from here, from the US, or you can come from another country and be here as an immigrant who's trying to make it just like your other colleagues. I think it goes the same for everyone.
One of the things Dr. Barrow touches on here is her intersection of being a woman and an immigrant. Now, this is a really important topic, as a matter of fact, and it leads into another misconception, that model minorities have strong family values, which means even away from home, they're set in America. When you look at communities of women who are single mothers, widows, or people whose marriages that happened here or abroad fell apart, you see an even bigger problem: a lack of resources for immigrant women of color. Because we are seen as having only success stories, the concept of single motherhood or even of single womanhood in America is buried away for model minorities. According to datacenter.kidscount.org, 15% of Asian households are single-parent households. And as I will explain later, those stats are not only slightly flawed, but also a population that accounts for 48 different countries, multiple ethnic groups, and yet constitutes merely 5% of the American population. This is because Asians have issue when it comes to being properly counted for the census, and it's part of what makes us so invisible. Dr. Barrow explained to me the pressure to always be successful for model minorities in America.
And I think I should also add that because of this whole myth around I left my country as a minority here, I have to, you're kind of pressured that you have to show that you can make it. And people have to go through a lot of adjustment. Maybe you are not speaking English, or you are not at the level where you should be as required by the institution, or maybe you have to get used to the educational system. It's not really what you know. So some adjustment process has to go on to a point where you feel more comfortable, but at the end of the day you feel like, yes, I can make it, but after so much work, after so much pressure. And the pressure is there because, like I said earlier, it's not an easy thing leaving everything behind and going to a new country. So I feel like the pressure is there. I know personally, I did feel the pressure when first I was sent by my institution in Senegal, selected from a group of students to be here and do the kind of work I had to do. Yes, you want to make sure you do what you were sent to do, right? And you also have the same, pressure coming from maybe family members who would sometimes say, well, you're there studying 8 years, 10 years, that's a long time. When are you going to come back home? Things like that. That's, a lot of pressure. Yeah.
As for U.S. universities, for immigrants, it's a rat race to try and score a green card or a job that can promise an HB1 visa, as many are here on student visas. And once your visa expires for whatever reason it may be, you become undocumented. We'll return back to the concept of citizenship status in another episode, but for now, let's finish up why the model minority myth erases our communities. The final way this myth leaves us out of the conversation is by quite literally leaving us out of the conversation. Now, what do I mean by this? Because all Asians are grouped into one big category, Asian, we often find ourselves all the more erased when it comes to dialoguing on social issues. East Asian culture is quite different than South Asian culture, and even within that, South Indian culture, for example, is different than North Indian ones. This level of diversity is unique only to the Asian racial category. No other racial category in the world has that level of difference within it. And because racial issues in America are often talked about in a binary, our different races within the communities and even our different issues we face are often overwritten. When we discuss diversity, people jump to the black and white binary. Same for when mentioning the term person of color. For many, the first thing that comes to mind when hearing this term is a black and white binary. Black and white tensions are hugely important and need to be discussed at the table. And the model minority myth plays a role in leaving Asian, Middle Eastern, and African voices out of it. It serves as a poorly constructed band-aid that creates a perception that we are all one with one standard issue and one standard solution. This is why it becomes important to recognize the term people of color as being a bridge to open up conversations about racial and social justice with other demographics, including other groups such as Native Americans and Latinos. There also comes another problematic ideology that comes with this myth that states that East Asians don't actually qualify as people of color.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that before, and I think it wasn't until I started to really get acquainted with or just develop more knowledge about activism and social justice spaces. There is a rich history of Asian Americans engaged in social justice and, identifying as people of color. And I think it's more about identifying as people who are marginalized. I think that's really what's underneath that kind of label of person of color, right? It's kind of a label to describe that, I have experiences of racial marginalization and I'm not the majority. There's this idea that Asian Americans are honorary whites, that they're just as equal as being white Americans, and that has to do with the model minority myth, right? So I think there is this, even to this day, I have hesitancy sometimes in certain spaces to call myself a person of color. But, generally I do identify as someone who is part of a racially marginalized group, and I think that just needs to be, it needs more light shed on it, that Asian Americans do care about social justice and are victims of oppression. But that also doesn't mean we should, not talk about how Asian Americans are complicit in racism, too.
That's Jackie Yee. She's a third-year grad student in the clinical psychology PhD program at the University of Illinois. She studies how and why people engage in social justice, and I actually had the chance to participate in her current study about that very topic. This concept of Asian Americans being able to identify as a marginalized group is important for another reason, too. There's actually a video of Loretta Ross, an African-American academic, feminist, and activist, that went viral discussing where the term woman of color, which was brought into the term people of color, came from.
Y'all know where the term women of color came from? Who can say that? See, we're bad at transmitting history. In 1977, a group of black women from Washington, D.C. went to the National Women's Conference that Jimmy Carter had given $5 million to have as part of the World Decade for Women. There was a conference in Houston, Texas. This group of black women carried to that conference something called a Black Women's Agenda, because the organizers of the conference, Bella Abdul, Ellie Smil, and what have you, had put together a 3-page minority women's plank in a 200-page document that these black women thought was somewhat inadequate. And so they actually formed a group called Black Women's Agenda.
What Loretta goes on to describe is the story of how this group of black women presented their agenda for social rights, and another group of women stood up in solidarity. Not only that, but this group of women spoke out to say that they would love to join the cause, as many of the issues they face intersected with what they were already hearing. The second group of women were none other than Asian American women.
Well, they agreed, except that you could no longer call it the Black Women's Agenda. And it was in those negotiations in Houston the term women of color was created. Okay? And they didn't see it as a biological designation. You're born Asian, you're born black, you're born African American, whatever. It is a solidarity definition, a commitment to work in collaboration with other oppressed women of color who have been minoritized.
Exactly. It's all about solidarity. And I think personally, when you're mentioning the black and white binary, it's also important to address the issue of anti-blackness in the Asian community. There are forces that have contributed to the anti-blackness in Asian American communities, specifically fostered through movements by people in positions of power that painted black Americans as problematic and pitted them against Asians as a threat to our security in the U.S., whether that was through fear-mongering of crime targeting our businesses or the quote-unquote threat of affirmative action. This is all the more reason why Asians and even Middle Easterners need to check ourselves first, and then check our friends, and then check our families, because by siding with the oppressor, even if it is as a survival tactic, we will not only continue to remain oppressed, but we will aid in the bringing down of a community that we have historically worked with to foster solidarity. So, as we've seen, there are a couple different ways the model minority myth itself has led us to be named the Invisibles. And being unable to differentiate between groups and lumping us into one has greatly taken away from our autonomy in racial and ethnic discussions. Now, this problem actually arises somewhere else, too. This brings me to my second reason why the model minorities are the invisible minorities. This is how the U.S. Census erases us. People of Middle Eastern descent are required to choose white on the census form, and although the Census Committee promised that they'd add a section called MENA, which stands for Middle Eastern or North African descent, Representative Tlaib recently pointed out that it will not be included on the 2020 census.
Starting in 2015, a research effort spanned years under the previous administration, led by the Office of Management and Budget, by community organizations like Access and the Arab American Institute and many others, which pushed to add the new category to the 2020 survey called Middle Eastern North African, or what we call MENA. In 2015, Director, the category went into the field for testing, and based on the findings, the Census Bureau recommended the inclusion of MENA category in the 2020 census. Despite these findings, however, the Census Bureau announced under the current administration that MENA category would not be included in the census. Dr. Dillingham, do I look white to you?
Congresswoman, I think that if you tell me what you identify with, and I think I would respect that.
Sure. So, Dr. Director, are you aware that people like me who are Arab, Middle Eastern, North African have to indicate that they're white on the U.S. Census?
Congresswoman, we actually have on the, and I understand, that there was a process in deciding, certainly before I got to the census, and there's a history to coming up with the questions and the race and the ethnicity categories, and that OMB...
No, they ignored it.
Director,
but they ignored it. The previous administration decided to put MENA on the form. They ignored it. But do you think if I circled white category, that would be an accurate depiction of my racial and ethnic background?
Congresswoman, we do not second guess what you put down
okay.
there.
Well,
and we do have a write-in. We do have a write-in.
Director,
People can
you're not giving me an option, because let me tell you, there's a reason why the recommendation happened. Sure. Because would circling white on the census change my lived experience as a person of color in our country, right? Even saying that, you understand there's a difference when you actually have the checkoff box.
This issue presents itself in other model minority data as well. African immigrants, for example, are not distinguished from other Black Americans and African Americans. And as for Asians, you see this issue arise yet again.
You look at yourself as somebody coming from a particular country. You're from this country. Maybe you identify yourself more with a language that you speak than as a Black person. So although we have this shared history, you can see that the experiences are not the same, right? But as you stay longer in this country, you begin to understand where they are coming from. And then you start merging into one, like the Black experience becomes a common experience. And then sometimes maybe you even go through the same experiences, right, as Black people. It's just that in the beginning, we don't seem to actually reckon with the fact that, yes, there's racism, something can be racist, but we don't see it as racism just because we're coming fresh, and where we come from, most of the times you don't go through those issues.
Now, this is not a question of how to identify immigrants from non-immigrants. Rather, it's a perception issue. I'm very proud of the fact that people have the freedom to identify however they feel vibes with them the best. But what happens when we try to and need to categorize people anyway? Here's a case study. When white immigrants come to the United States, they are typically able to assimilate into American society within a generation's time, with no other factors separating them from other white Americans other than self-distinction. However, with Asian immigrants, for obvious reasons in race and ethnic origin, many families can be here for generations and still not be seen as American. Because of the discrimination that comes with this in housing, hiring, customer service, and more, there's a need for resources such as centers and money to fund those resources for those target communities. It's an issue particularly for resource allocation. When you have things like language barriers and immigration aid and scholarships that may be provided towards target immigrant communities, such as Asian and African immigrants, you're leaving people to fall through the cracks. Also, when you're grouping all Asians and Africans and even Middle Eastern immigrants together, the diversity and specific needs for each community becomes erased. Southeast Asians require different resources and speak different languages than East Asians and than South Asians. So, how are we supposed to gain and allocate ample funding for these communities when they are lumped together? This is why many are fighting for the census to disaggregate Asian data. By disaggregating it, the model minority myth would also become exposed, as you would see that not all Asians are the same or even super privileged. This is the same for people of Middle Eastern origins. By providing a category on the census, they are able to distinguish themselves from the quote-unquote white racial category, which in many ways does not provide a holistic picture of their identity. And while there is an open-ended question about ancestry on the census, it's, again, not as effective as simply broadening a category or even disaggregating data. For many immigrants, answering such an open-ended question is not only confusing, but also scary. For undocumented Asians, even the fear of immigration officers, ICE, and police is enough to scare them away from participating in the census. This goes for naturalized citizens, elderly citizens, and those who speak English as a second language as well. Indian Americans are the fastest growing undocumented population in America, and Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial ethnic group in the U.S., according to pewresearch.org. So, considering that the census has ties to funding for these racial groups and only occurs once every 10 years, it's all the more important for model minorities to show up and get counted in the 2020 census. We discussed a lot of reasons why the model minority myth is debunked in different contexts, and we reviewed how the census and other stats play a role in why and how this myth gets perpetuated. But it's important to note that our inter-community perception of how to live a life and ensure success in this country plays a role in erasing us as well. But we're out there. There are activists, there are politicians, and there are even artists that are highlighting our inner and outer community issues in solidarity with the issues of others. So stay tuned for our next episode titled Crazy Not So Rich Asians, where I talk about the economic successes and failures and the hefty price model minorities pay to be in this country. And that concludes the end of episode 2. Woo! If you have topics that you want me to cover, go ahead and tweet me at Minority Model on Twitter or follow me on Facebook under the same name as this podcast, Model Minority, Uniquely American. Model Minority was created, written, and produced by yours truly, Nidhi Shastri. Funding for this podcast came from a grant through the Gender Women's Studies building at the University of Illinois. If you like what I do and would like to contribute, you can find me on Patreon at patreon.com/modelminority. As always, shukriya, thanks for listening, and I'm glad to have you here.